Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us on the last in this series of lessons where we're going to be looking at today, most specifically, the paper 1 content, where we're going to be looking at the civil rights movement and the in the USA and the Black Power movement. And as you know, these are your paper 1 content, your civil rights movement. We'll be looking at the source-based questions. We'll be going through a paper. We'll be looking at some skills, answering some source-based questions on that. And then the Black Power movement as your essay question. Okay. So first, as we did before, we're just going to be doing a brief overview of the content that we're going to be covering in this section, and we're going to start with a source-based question, which is looking at the civil rights movement. Okay, so right, the key question that we're going to be looking at in this section is looking at the reasons why the civil rights movement emerged in the USA and the short and long-term gains of the civil rights movement. Okay, so what were the reasons for the US civil rights movement? So after the American Civil War, the US government then passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and equal rights to former black slaves. 1866, the Ku Klux Klan was set up, and they were against any rights for African Americans and wanted segregation to continue. And as more civil rights were granted to African Americans, the Ku Klux Klan became more violent. The violence attacks on houses were carried out, and approximately 175 African Americans were lynched per year between 1890 and 1900. So in 1896, the US Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities for white and black Americans was constitutional, okay? And this is kind of purporting the idea that as long as we're providing them with the same type of facilities, it was considered equal. It didn't mean that it had to be granted together. All right. So that law then remained in place until 1954. And this was then the driving reason for the civil rights movement to provide African Americans with a strategy to fight against the disregard for their constitutional and civil rights. Okay. So that's just an image of the Ku Klux Klan doing the burnings, which they often did in people's front yards. And that is an example of lynching that occurred, where they would hang people from trees. And it's quite shocking when we look at it. People laughing, it looks normal, it's okay. Children not even looking remotely disturbed by it because it was just part of life, okay? So after they hanged him, they shot him, they castrated him. That really got on my nerve, okay? So we're going to be looking at now the origins of the US civil rights movement. Where did it emerge? Why did it emerge? What were the reasons? So in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was set up. And in 1935, they challenged segregation in higher education in the nation's courts, and they won significant rights for African Americans in universities across the country. After World War II, the movement then gained momentum for many reasons. Firstly, many African Americans moved north to take defense-related jobs. They had the vote in the north. The north was definitely more liberal, which increased the voting strength. African Americans serving in the army abroad experienced less racial discrimination, and soldiers had fought for democracy and upon returning home fought against racism and for their own democratic rights, okay? So that starts the foundation and the reasons why people started fighting for the rights in the USA. So the responses in the southern states, okay, the southern states responded by taking away African American rights. The activities of the Ku Klux Klan increased in the 1950s, and many southern states refused to comply with laws and court rulings. For example, the 1954 landmark case ruling that desegregation should take place in school, which was won by the NAACP, contributed to the growing civil rights movement. Okay. There's also the influences of Martin Luther King Jr. that you'll remember from your lessons. Okay, so King, he was a pastor in the city of Montgomery, which became the center of the civil rights movement. And his position as a pastor allowed him to take on the leadership role within the struggle, as he was able to see the struggles of his congregation firsthand. And that position gave him a platform from which to speak of the injustices that he saw. His leadership role was affirmed when he was elected to lead the Montgomery bus boycott, and from there his role increased and he became the spotlight of the non-violent resistance. And in 1957, after the success of the bus boycott, he and other activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the SCLC and King then planned to achieve full equality for all African Americans through non-violence. And King remained the leader of the organization until his death, and he traveled the world and country giving lectures on non-violent protests and civil rights. So, what was the impact of Martin Luther King Jr.? So he became a unifying force in the struggles for civil rights through his charismatic personality and his very strong leadership skills. He drew the various movements together, which became more coordinated and more focused. It attracted the attention of the whole of the USA and the rest of the world. King's nonviolent approach and profound wisdom is what won him support. His stature then enabled the movement to achieve many of their aims, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He also became influential in other issues such as the Vietnam War and poverty. But unfortunately, a rift grew between King and the more radical youth who rejected his non-violent methods as they were seen to be ineffectual. And they then formed the Black Panther Party, a militant group that aimed to overthrow the white status quo with force. We're going to be discussing that a little bit later when we get to the essay section. So that was the impact of Martin Luther King and what he did. But now we're going to just briefly touch on what were his influences, okay? What was the reason why he decided to adopt that non-violent approach? So Martin Luther King, like many other people who embarked on passive resistance movements such as Albert Lutuli, were influenced by passive resistance, which was of Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, so he was influenced by the writing of Mahatma Gandhi. He saw in Gandhi's philosophy the Christian ethic of love being used as a strategy for change. He came to believe that non-violence was the only way that African Americans would be able to win the struggle for freedom in the USA, and non-violence therefore informed all his speeches and actions during the civil rights movement. So, what were the forms of protest that through civil disobedience? Okay, and remember that these may form the case studies that you will be given in your source-based questions. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the bus boycotts, the freedom rides, sit-ins, peaceful marches, and usually these non-violent actions were met with violence from the white supremacists and often the police as well. And those who participated in the campaigns were trained not to retaliate, but they were accused of being the agitators and for provoking the violence because they embarked on these passive resistance campaigns. So, the Montgomery bus boycotts, that's the first of these that we're going to be looking at. So Montgomery in the south was a city where the segregation laws were very strong in the 1950s, and on the 1st of December 1955, Rosa Parks, who was secretary to the NAACP, was arrested for not giving up her seat on a city bus to a white man. As a result, the NAACP, which was led by King, organized a boycott of the city buses, and the boycott lasted for 381 days, placing a severe economic strain on the public transport system, and it finally ended on the 20th of December 1956. And the US Supreme Court then ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. So this might be, sources around this might be one of the case studies that might be used in your final examination and in your mock examination. Sometimes you might look at just one of these case studies, so there will be several sources, both visual sources as well as your 3 written sources, your 1 visual source, which might be on one of these case studies, so they might look at just the Montgomery bus boycotts. Or, alternatively, they may look at a few of the different protests. So they might look at the Montgomery bus boycotts as well as the sit-ins, as well as the freedom rides, okay? And then your sources will then center around looking at passive resistance in its entirety, okay? Rather than just one singular case study. We then have the Greensboro sit-in, okay? So the writings of King then inspired 4 students in the city of Greensboro in North Carolina. So on the 1st of February 1960, the 4 decided to sit down at the whites-only lunch table at Woolworths and order coffee. They were refused service but said that they would stay in their seats until they were served. So each day, other students joined them and the sit-in spread to other restaurants. And it also spread to other southern states and lasted for more than a year, with businesses losing more than a third of their income. And in the summer of 1961, businesses in Greensboro decided to desegregate. And much like apartheid, it was mainly because they were losing so much money. So the sit-ins drew many students into the campaign and led to the setting up of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. So, we then move into the Freedom Rides. Sorry, the title is not coming on. So, the Freedom Rides were organized in 1961 by the SNCC and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. So, in May 1961, African American and white volunteers sat next to each other on public buses as they traveled from the north to the south. And when they reached Alabama, white mobs burnt one of the buses while the police stood by and looked on. So although many freedom riders were thrown in jail, the violent treatment did not stop them, and over the next 6 months, more than 1,000 people joined that campaign. The images of brutality were televised around the world and embarrassed the Kennedy administration, and as a result, the Kennedy administration put an end to the violence, and Interstate Commerce Commission banned segregation of all interstate transport. President Kennedy delivered a civil rights address to the nation on the 11th of June 1963, which called on all Americans to recognize the movement as a moral cause to which everyone should contribute. So, there were various campaigns and marches that occurred in the U.S. Civil rights movement, and one of these that we're going to be looking at is the Birmingham Campaign. So there were many marches, sit-ins and boycotts that were organized in Birmingham, which became the center of violence in 1963. And the campaigns were met with police violence, which was led by Commander Eugene Connor, who used fire hoses, police dogs, and gaol sentences to disperse the marchers. On the 2nd of May, 1,000 children gathered in churches and began the Children's Crusade. 600 children were arrested and imprisoned, and fire hoses and police dogs were deployed on the marchers in what became known as Double D-Day. The images were broadcast internationally and led to international sympathy for the movement. On the 10th of May, it was announced that segregation would end, but segregationists retaliated against this decision. They bombed the home of Martin Luther King's brother. They bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 African American girls. And the Birmingham Campaign was a mass movement that demanded fundamental economic and social change. And the campaign was actually very successful in spreading the movement to the north. Remember, the people in the north were not as severely affected by segregation laws as people in the south. There was also the March to Lincoln Memorial. Now remember what I'm saying is that the examiner may take just one of these case studies or may look at a few case studies, okay? And then you will get your written and visual sources are either going to focus on just the one, or they're going to look at the link between a couple of different case studies. So the March to Lincoln Memorial happened in August 1963 and was the largest political gathering in US history. It had 6 goals: civil rights legislation, a federal works program, the right to vote, integrated education, better housing, and better employment opportunities. Between 250,000 and 400,000 people joined the march, where King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, and many contemporaries regarded the march as a positive part of the civil rights movement, whilst others thought it was a sanitized, middle-class version of the real Black Power movement. They wanted more radical change. Freedom Summer is another one of those that we can that can be examined as well. So on the 22nd of November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. On the 2nd of July 1964, Congress accepted the Civil Rights Act, which banned segregation and discrimination. So in the Freedom Summer of 1964, thousands of volunteers launched a voter registration drive in the South. Activists were threatened and harassed, and 3 young civil rights workers were actually murdered as a result. And you can actually see the story has been made into a movie, okay, Mississippi Burning. It is quite an eye-opener watching something like that where, the case gets investigated. So Freedom Summer attracted national attention and led to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And a reminder again that they can take aspects out of this. This is just, what I'm going through is just a broad overview of the case studies that that can be examined at the end of the year. We also have the Selma to Montgomery marches. So in early 1965, Selma in Alabama, was the focus of voter registration and demonstrations. And on February the 18th, white segregationists attacked a group of demonstrators and killed a young African-American demonstrator. In response, King and the movement planned a march from Selma to Montgomery, and on the 7th of March, a group of 600 people set out on the march, but they were attacked with whips, batons, and tear gas. The violence was captured on television, which drew even more demonstrators to Selma, and on the 9th of March, the marchers were met with more force, and a young white minister, James Reed, was actually beaten to death. President Johnson backed the march, and he pledged his support, sending US Army troops to protect them. Okay, we're now going to get into one that was used as a focus for a number of years, the case study previously, okay, 2016 and prior. And I know that in most textbooks, this is the one that is labeled as the case study, especially the Little Rock 9 case study. But please don't be distracted by that, okay? This was the case study when CAPS was initially introduced, but remember that it is not going to be that your final exam is going to be based on the school desegregation case. The school desegregation case, the Little Rock 9 case, becomes one of the possible case studies that can be examined, okay? So don't just focus your attention on studying to a school desegregation. It has been made very clear to us that school desegregation is only one of the possibilities. It might not be examined at all. It might be examined on its own. It might be examined in relation to or along with other topics, okay, within this section. Please don't only focus your studies on school desegregation because it says case study in your textbook. All of these are case studies, okay, so you need to give equal focus in your studies to all of them. Right. So school desegregation is one of the bigger topics, and like I said, it was a main focus a number of years ago with examinations. But school integration was a major focus of the civil rights struggle. There were 5 lawsuits that were launched to desegregate high schools in 1952 in what became known as the Brown versus Board of Education. And in May 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. Okay, so the case study that is in your textbooks, okay, is labeled the Little Rock, Arkansas, okay. So in Little Rock, Arkansas, 17 African American students were chosen to enter the all-white Central High in an attempt to kind of promote desegregation. 17 became 9 after some of the parents withdrew their children due to the feared black backlash. And the day before school opening, the governor called in the National Guard to surround the school, stating that he feared white supremacists would attack. As a result, none of the 9 actually attended school that day. The next day, Daisy Bates of the NAACP organized for all those students to meet at her house and walk together. And one girl, Elizabeth Eckford, didn't get the message and was ambushed as she tried to enter the school. And for the next 17 days, the National Guard prevented the Little Rock 9 from entering the school. So we see there that the Little Rock 9 were called in to protect the students, but they actually came in eventually they actually ended up preventing these students from attending. The NAACP won a case forcing the governor to integrate the schools, and as a result he withdrew the National Guard, who were replaced by more than 1,000 angry white protesters. The students entered the school via a side door, which led to the growing violence of the mob outside, and fearing escalated violence, the students were rushed home and the president was asked to help keep the peace. President Eisenhower addressed all Americans saying that mob rule would not be allowed. And as a result, the National Guard protected the Little Rock 9 for the duration of the year. The 9 was still, however, subjected to racial hatred, and one of the 9, Melba Patillo, was stabbed and had acid sprayed in her eyes. Before schools opened in 1958, the governor, with the support of the white population, closed all schools in Little Rock rather than proceeding with desegregation. And in June 1959, the Supreme Court ruled that the school board must reopen the schools and resume the process of desegregation. So in August, schools opened, 250 protesters marched to Central High, but this time the police acted quickly and 21 people were arrested. Only in 1972 were all grades in the Little Rock public schools integrated. Okay, so it took
On September 24, 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower flew from Rhode Island to Washington, D.C. to address the nation about violent resistance to 9 African-American students attempting to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is the president's 13-minute address where he announced he was sending federal troops to ensure the student safety.
From the President's office in the White House in Washington, D.C., we present a special address by the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Mr. Eisenhower discusses the integration problem at Little Rock, Arkansas. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. For a few minutes this evening, I should like to speak to you about the serious situation that has arisen in Little Rock. To make this talk, I have come to the President's office in the White House. I could have spoken from Rhode Island, where I have been staying recently. But I felt that, in speaking from the house of Lincoln, of Jackson, and of Wilson, my words would better convey both the sadness I feel in the action I was compelled today to make, and the firmness with which I intend to pursue this course until the orders of the federal court at Little Rock can be executed without unlawful interference. In that city, under the leadership of demagogic extremists, disorderly mobs have deliberately prevented the carrying out of proper orders from a federal court. Local authorities have not eliminated that violent opposition. And under the law, I yesterday issued a proclamation calling upon the mob to disperse. This morning, the mob again gathered in front of the Central High School of Little Rock, obviously for the purpose of again preventing the carrying out of the court's order relating to the admission of Negro children to that school. Whenever normal agencies prove inadequate to the task, and it becomes necessary for the executive branch of the federal government to use its powers and authority to uphold federal courts, the President's responsibility is inescapable. In accordance with that responsibility, I have today issued an executive order directing the use of troops under federal authority to aid in the execution of federal law at Little Rock, Arkansas. This became necessary when my proclamation of yesterday was not observed, and the obstruction of justice still continues. It is important that the reasons for my action be understood by all our citizens. As you know, the Supreme Court of the United States has decided that separate public educational facilities for the races are inherently unequal, and therefore compulsory school segregation laws are unconstitutional. Our personal opinions about the decision have no bearing on the matter of enforcement. The responsibility and authority of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution are very clear. Local federal courts were instructed by the Supreme Court to issue such orders and decrees as might be necessary to achieve admission to public schools without regard to race and with all deliberate speed. During the past several years, many communities in our southern states have instituted public school plans for gradual progress in the enrollment and attendance of school children of all races in order to bring themselves into compliance with the law of the land. Thus they demonstrated to the world that we are a nation in which laws, not men, are supreme. I regret to say that this truth, the cornerstone of our liberties, was not observed in this instance. It was my hope that this localized situation would be brought under control by city and state authorities. If the use of local police powers had been sufficient, our traditional method of leaving the problem in those hands would have been pursued. But when large gatherings of obstructionists made it impossible for the decrees of the court to be carried out, both the law and the national interest demanded that the President take action. Here is the sequence of events in the development of the Little Rock school case. In May of 1955, the Little Rock School Board approved a moderate plan for the gradual desegregation of the public schools in that city. It provided that a start toward integration would be made at the present term in the high school, and that the plan would be in full operation by 1963. Here I might say that in a number of communities in Arkansas, integration in the schools has already started, and without violence of any kind. Now, this Little Rock plan was challenged in the courts by some who believed that the period of time as proposed in the plan was too long. The United States Court at Little Rock, which has supervisory responsibility under the law for the plan of desegregation in the public schools, dismissed the challenge, thus approving a gradual rather than an abrupt change from the existing system. The court found that the school board had acted in good faith in planning for a public school system free from racial discrimination. Since that time, the court has on 3 separate occasions issued orders directing that the plan be carried out. All persons were instructed to refrain from interfering with the efforts of the school board to comply with the law. Proper and sensible observance of the law then demanded the respectful obedience which the nation has a right to expect from all its people. This, unfortunately, has not been the case at Little Rock. Certain misguided persons, many of them imported into Little Rock by agitators, have insisted upon defying the law and have sought to bring it into disrepute. The orders of the court have thus been frustrated. The very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rests upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the President's command. Unless the President did so, anarchy would result. There would be no security for any, except that which each one of us could provide for himself. The interest of the nation in the proper fulfillment of the law's requirements cannot yield to opposition and demonstrations by some few persons. Mob rule can not be allowed to override the decisions of our courts. Now let me make it very clear that federal troops are not being used to relieve local and state authorities of their primary duty to preserve the peace and order of the community. Nor are the troops there for the purpose of taking over the responsibility of the school board and other responsible local officials in running Central High School. The running of our school system and the maintenance of peace and order in each of our states are strictly local affairs, and the federal government does not interfere except in very special cases and when requested by one of the several states. In the present case, the troops are there pursuant to law solely for the purpose of preventing interference with the orders of the court. The proper use of the powers of the executive branch to enforce the orders of a federal court is limited to extraordinary and compelling circumstances. Manifestly, such an extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise. The overwhelming majority of our people in every section of the country are united in their respect for observance of the law, even in those cases where they may disagree with that law. They deplore the call of extremists to violence. The decision of the Supreme Court concerning school integration, of course, affects the South more seriously than it does other sections of the country. In that region, I have many warm friends, some of them in the city of Little Rock. I have deemed it a great personal privilege to spend in our Southland tours of duty while in the military service and enjoyable recreational periods since that time. So, from intimate personal knowledge, I know that the overwhelming majority of the people in the South, including those of Arkansas and of Little Rock, are of goodwill, united in their efforts to preserve and respect the law even when they disagree with it. They do not sympathize with mob rule. They, like the rest of our nation, have proved in two great wars their readiness to sacrifice for America. And the foundation of the American way of life is our national respect for law. In the South as elsewhere, citizens are keenly aware of the tremendous disservice that has been done to the people of Arkansas in the eyes of the nation, and that has been done to the nation in the eyes of the world. At a time when we face grave situations abroad because of the hatred that communism bears toward a system of government based on human rights, it would be difficult to exaggerate the harm that is being done to the prestige and influence, and indeed to the safety of our nation and the world. Our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation. we are portrayed as a violator of those standards of conduct which the peoples of the world united to proclaim in the Charter of the United Nations. There they affirm faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity and worth of the human person. And they did so without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And so, with deep confidence, I call upon the citizens of the state of Arkansas to assist in bringing to an immediate end all interference with the law and its processes. If resistance to the federal court order ceases at once, the further presence of federal troops will be unnecessary, and the city of Little Rock will return to its normal habits of peace and order, and a blot upon the fair name and high honor of our nation in the world will be removed. Thus will be restored the image of America and of all its parts as one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good night, and thank you very much.
Okay, so as we can see, the President's overwhelming support, President Eisenhower's overwhelming support for desegregation to occur, and obviously using the communism, capitalism debate as his motivation for it. Okay. And so the Little Rock crisis then kind of highlighted this dire need to actually move beyond segregation and start moving forward with a more integrated United States by starting with the desegregation of schools. Okay, so lastly we look at what the short and long-term gains of the civil rights movement was. All right, so that period 1955 to 1965 was the high point of the civil rights movement. Television broadcasts and magazines kept the civil rights movement's message alive for millions of people, and it became a mass movement during that decade. The Montgomery bus boycott launched the movement. The Greensboro sit-in brought the students to the movement. Student activity then increased with the Freedom Rides and Freedom Summer. So you see that domino effect of events happening, okay, where one event actually leads to another. All right? Sorry, I should move this off the screen. The crisis in Little Rock had a profound impact on America and on the rest of the world. It showed the lengths to which some Southerners would go to prevent integration, and it also showed African Americans that they could get their rights guaranteed by the Constitution if they made themselves heard on the street and in the courtroom. By 1965, the Selma to Montgomery March clearly showed both how far African American blacks had come and how far they still had to go. And 10 years earlier, they had timidly asked if they could sit in the front of the bus. Now they were demanding their full rights as American citizens. They had courts and a president who were willing to make rulings and pass laws to guarantee their safety and their rights, but they still faced strong, violent opposition, and blacks were not at the end of the road, but they were further along than they had ever been before. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were two of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in public services and on the job, and in the follow-up Voting Rights Act of 1965, the federal government guaranteed all African Americans the right to vote. By the 1970s, substantial numbers of African Americans had been elected to public and private office throughout the southern states. Okay. And then moving to present day, that although the USA has still not achieved full equality for all Americans in practice, despite such equality existing in law, the fact that an African American was elected President of the USA in 2008 is an indication of how far the nation has traveled in promoting and protecting equal civil and constitutional rights for all, African Americans, other minorities, and white people alike. Okay. Sadly, that administration did not continue, but it shows that there was a step in the right direction. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the Black Power movement a little bit later, okay? And I just want to get to the question paper that we're going to be looking at for the source-based test. Okay, so for this particular test, I looked at the school desegregation question. There we go. And the other one would be the addendum. Okay. So I looked at the school desegregation for this particular question. Okay. Okay, so like I mentioned in previous lessons, the way it works is that you're going to get three different sources and one visual source for your examinations, okay? And they are, and for this particular section, like I said, they are either going to focus on a specific case study, so maybe looking at the Freedom Rides on its own, or the Montgomery bus boycotts on its own, or the Selma to Montgomery march on its own. Or it could look at a few of those together to see how one event kind of leads to another, okay? For this particular assessment, I focused on the school desegregation, okay? So, like I mentioned before, this first part always contextualizes the source for you. And here it says the source below is an extract taken from notes by President Dwight Eisenhower on the 8th of October 1957 after his meeting with Governor Forbes. And it focuses on the visit of Forbes of Arkansas to Little Rock on the 14th of September 1957, and the meeting took place in Newport. So it tells us who, it tells us where, it tells us what, and it tells us when. All the W's, okay? Alright. So Governor Forbes protested again and again that he was a law-abiding citizen, that he was a veteran who fought in the war, and that everybody recognizes that federal law is supreme to state law. So I suggested to him that he go home and not necessarily withdraw the National Guard troops, but just change the orders to say that having been assured that there was no attempt to do anything except to obey the courts, and the federal government was not trying to do anything that had not been already agreed to by the social school board and directed by the courts, that he should tell the Guard to continue to preserve order, but to allow Negro children to attend Central High School. I pointed out at that time that he was due to appear the following Friday the 20th before the court to determine whether an injunction compelling court order was to be issued. I further said that I did not believe it was to anybody to have a trial of strength that it was to the benefit of anybody, I apologize, to have a trial of strength between the president and the governor, because in any area where the federal government had assumed jurisdiction, that's authority, and this was upheld by the Supreme Court, there could be only one outcome, and that is that the state would lose, and I did not want to see any governor humiliated. He seemed to be very appreciative of this attitude, and I got definitely the understanding that he was going back to Arkansas to act within a matter of hours to revoke his orders to the Guard to prevent re-entry of the Negro children into the school. He told me that of his war experiences and vigorously asserted his deep feelings of loyalty and dedication to the federal government, and repeated several times that he had shown respect for the law in all his actions. Okay. So let us look now at the questions related to, and I'm going to, just for the sake of time, put up the ones that show the memo as well. Let me just make this a bit bigger so that you can see it a bit better on your screens. Okay, so consulting source 1A, quote 2 reasons from the source why Governor Forbes could be regarded by some as being good U.S. citizens. And again, we focus that this is a level 1 question, and we see it reflected then in the mark allocation. So in this case, we're looking for 2 pieces of information, okay? That's just extracted from the source. So, according to the source, it said that he was a law-abiding citizen, that he was a war veteran, that he fought in the Second World War, and that he recognizes the supremacy of the federal law, the law of the country over the laws of the individual states. Any 2 of those, you just need to extract a piece of information. What, according to the source, were the two instructions given to Forbes by President Eisenhower during their meeting? This again is a level 1 question, again reflected by the mark allocation, okay? The first mark tells us how many pieces of information we are looking for. The second mark then tells us how detailed that information must be. So in this case, it's 2 pieces of information, and for 1 mark each, that tells us it's a level 1 question. So in this case, to tell the guard to continue to preserve order, to tell the guard to allow African American children to attend Central High School, and to tell them to allow the African American to attend Central High School. It is simple extraction from the source, okay? There's nothing that we need to interpret or analyze over there. Alright, using the source and your own knowledge, okay? So here it asks you to bring in the knowledge that you know, that you've studied. Explain why there was a need for a meeting between Forbes and Eisenhower. And the source doesn't tell us directly what the meeting was about. So in this case, it's a level 2 question because we've got to bring in our own knowledge and we've got to analyze and we've got to compare our own knowledge with the evidence that is in the source. Okay? So, Forbes had, and we over here again look at the mark allocation, it tells us that we need 2 detailed pieces of information. Okay. So Forbes had resisted integration of education at Little Rock. Forbes had mobilized the National Guard to prevent African American students from entering Central High School. And those 2 then worked together. Okay. So he resisted the integration, and then by extension had then mobilized the National Guard to prevent the African American students from entering Central High School. So we're using our own knowledge and combining it with the knowledge from the source. Eisenhower wanted to achieve a resolution of the issue through negotiations or dialogue. We get that from the source. He'd gone there to talk about the issue. And he also wants to impress upon Forbes the supremacy of the federal law and the orders of the Supreme Court. So he wanted to remind him that this was the law of the country. And you don't have a choice. You've got to follow it. We also have to accept any other relevant response. So as examiners, we look at what are the other answers, what are the other interpretations that learners can come up with. And as long as you have evidence to validate your point, and your point is a valid, relevant point, it will be considered. Why, according to the source, did Eisenhower try to discourage Forbes from taking Little Rock 9 issue to court? Again, it's a level 1 question, simple extraction question. Okay? The state of Arkansas was bound to lose in court. Forbes as governor would be humiliated. That comes directly from the source. I apologize. This is meant to be a 2 times 1, not a 1 times 2. So that should just be the other way around. There would be a trial of strength between the president and the governor. And that it was not advisable, and it could lead to international criticism of America's laws. And we heard that kind of reflected in Eisenhower's speech as well. Comment on whether Eisenhower was justified in instructing Forbes to change the orders that he gave to the National Guard regarding the events at Central High School. Okay? Was he justified? So here we need to analyze, evaluate, interpret. Okay? And this is then a level 3 question. So we're looking for 2 detailed pieces of information. So you need to first evaluate whether he was justified or not justified. And when you look at my memo, you will see that I look at both sides. Okay. So if he was justified, okay, law and order had to be restored in Little Rock. He defended the rights of black students. The government made an unflinching commitment that it would not tolerate racism. He was for enforcing federal legislation, so national legislation, and the decision of the courts in respect of equal education. And Forbes had defined a legitimate and just instruction from the president. Okay. And also they looking at if there are any other relevant responses that learners come up with. You could argue not justified based on law. Okay. Not on anything moral, but just based on law. Forbes was a law-abiding citizen, and the laws of the state actually justified segregation. The federal government could be seen as interfering in state affairs. Remember, the states in America have the right to make their own laws. So when national government comes in, they are then interfering in state affairs. Forbes was waiting for a directive from the courts, okay, so people had taken it to court, and he was waiting for a directive from the courts, and he was therefore enforcing state law until the courts decided otherwise. So you see there, none of the possible answers that I've given over there relate to whether this was morally wrong, right or wrong. Absolutely none of those. Those are just based on the law, the legislation at the time, okay? And so you could look at that as a possible option in that case. So now we look at source 1B. I'm just going to also just make this a little bit bigger so you can see it a bit better. Okay, so again, we look at the contextualization of the source. Please don't neglect this part, okay? This is important. It tells you sometimes what, when, who, where, okay? So this extract describes the hardships that African American students who attended the all-white Central High School faced, and it focuses on how they and their families were harassed. Although some of the students, teachers, and administration attempted to maintain a sense of normality, for the 9 students that integrated Central High School, it was like going to war every day. One of the Little Rock 9, Melba Patillo Beals, describes their experience in her book, Warriors Don't Cry. My 8 friends and I paid for the integration of Central High with our innocence. During those years, when we desperately needed approval from our peers, we were victims of the harshest rejection imaginable. The physical and psychological punishment we endured profoundly affected our lives. It transformed us into warriors who dared not cry even when we suffered intolerable pain. Integration affected both their lives at school and at home. At school, these students were elbowed, poked, kicked, punched, and pushed. They faced verbal abuse from segregationists, as well as death threats against themselves, their families, and members of the black community. At home, their families endured threatening phone calls. Some of the parents lost their jobs. And the black community as a whole was harassed by bomb threats, gunshots, and bricks thrown through windows. While the students received some support from their community, they were also alienated by those who felt their actions jeopardized the safety of others. So, again, level 1 questions look at just defining concepts. So define the concept integration in the context of the Little Rock 9 incident. Okay. So integration in this case is bringing together, bringing people together. But the instruction part of the question tells us in the context of the Little Rock 9 incident. So we have to look at what does integration mean when we're looking at this particular source. So it means bringing together people of different racial groups to unite and accept one another, and the opening of education facilities to accommodate all races. Okay, so it's not asking you for a general definition of integration, which would stop after that first part, bringing together different people. Okay, but you need to be specific to this context. In the source formulates that the decision is the law of the land and must be obeyed. Explain whether you would regard the statement to be in line with the Little Rock 9 incident. Okay? So again, here you can look at 2 different aspects. We can say that Forbes did not act in line with the statement he made. He was trying to find justification to disregard the court's decision regarding the integration of schools. He argued that the decision of the court could only be implemented over time. It couldn't be an instant decision. He believed that integration would result in violence, and he was of the view that the federal government wanted to force state governments to agree on integration, even if that is against their state constitutions. Or you could say he acted in line with his statement. Remember, it's an opinion-based question. He believed that the interests of individual states must be protected and wanted to exploit the powers that a state has in the federal system. and he was responsible for effecting the constitution of the state of Arkansas. Again, it's not asking you to look at moral justification. It's not asking you to look at what's right and what is wrong. Okay? It's asking you to just use the information that is in the source to answer the question. Okay, using the source and your own knowledge, explain the messages that Forbes is trying to communicate to the public. Okay? So we now evaluate what he's trying to say. He's saying the state of Arkansas should not be hurried into integration of schools. He's saying that there needs to be a process. He's also stating that he's not opposed to segregation. He just wants to implement it gradually. Okay? Do it a little bit over time. He also stated that he was performing his duties under the Constitution of Arkansas. And he wanted to make the point clear that he had a public mandate and he owed it to the people of Arkansas to protect their interests. Now, we can argue on this last point about moral obligation because you also have a moral obligation to protect the interests of the other people in your state, which are African Americans, okay? And he wasn't doing this. But, here again, just stick to what the question is asking you, okay? What's the message that Forbes is trying to communicate? It doesn't ask you, do you agree with that message or not? Okay. So be very careful. You are going to run out of time. Time is going to be a challenge if we must evaluate the morality of that statement. And if you're going to go into the morality of that statement in answering this question, because remember that the paper is set that you are able to answer it in a certain amount of time. So when we are going to carry on with what the question is not asking us, okay, you're not going to get marks for it. It's not what the question is asking. So don't waste time trying to answer beyond what this question is asking you. Alright, so referring to sources A and B, so we're now making a comparison between the sources, okay? Explain how the information in source 1B and 1A differs. So we're looking at what the difference is between them regarding the commitments that Forbes made to President Eisenhower. Alright. So, in source 1A, now remember when we're doing the comparison, okay, 1A and 1B, that's 2 marks. Another 1A and 1B comparison is another 2 marks, okay? It's not you get 2 marks for drawing something from 1A and then another 2 marks for drawing one thing from 1B. No, you must have 2 different sets of comparisons, okay? 2 different sets. So in source 1A, Forbes states his commitment to uphold the federal constitution, but in 1B he argues for the respect of the constitution of the state of Arkansas. So he's saying, I respect the federal constitution, but in the other one he's saying, but I don't. So that's the difference, okay? We're looking for the difference in commitments. In source 1A, he creates the impression that he would immediately instruct the National Guard to allow the African American students to enter Central High School. But in 1B, he argues that the federal government must understand that integration cannot be achieved instantly. It's like arguing for a gradual process. So there he contradicts himself again because we're looking at the difference. In source 1A, he swears his loyalty to the federal government, but in 1B, he exhibits split loyalty, showing a loyalty to the state. Now we move on to 1C. Right. So again, we start with the contextualization of the source. So the extract discusses the reasons and resistance to the desegregation of schools in Hoxie, Arkansas in 1955. So we're now looking at how desegregation affected a different school in that same state. Okay. So school was scheduled to begin on July 11th, 1955, and in accordance with the unanimous vote by the school board, the Hoxie School District, believing it did not have the funds to maintain separate schools, moved to abolish its dual education system by integrating black children into its previously all-white schools, made up of approximately 1,000 white children. 25 black children initially registered. However, several dropped their enrollment, leaving 21 students to attend on the first day of classes. The superintendent of schools, Uncle Edward Vance, had given 3 reasons for integration. It was the right in the sight of God, It complied with the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and it saved money. Vaughn said that all school facilities would be integrated, not just the classrooms. And on the morning of July 11, 1955, the black children came to the white Hoxie schools. No incidents occurred on the first day of integration, and from initial appearances, Hoxie was a successful effort at school integration in Arkansas. On Monday, July 25, 1955, however, the situation changed as the latest issue of Life magazine appeared on newsstands across America. The intent of Life's pictorial essay was to recognize the small southern community's efforts towards compliance with the law. This effect, however, was a spotlight on Hoxie, which attracted the vocal ire of segregationists in the community, and soon in the state and region. On the 3rd of August 1955, approximately 350 segregationists from the local area gathered in Hoxie City Hall to protest the desegregation of Hoxie schools. They passed a resolution vowing not to patronize or support the Hoxie schools, and a boycott of the schools began the next day. Segregationists announced that half of the white student population remained at home. Although Superintendent Vance, while not issuing the actual figures, disputed the claim, the situation in Hoxie gained attention elsewhere as segregationists throughout Arkansas viewed integration in Hoxie as a test and prepared for confrontation with the Hoxie School Board, which remains resolute in its decision to integrate. The first outsiders came to Hoxie on the 13th of August 1955 when the Little Rock chapter of White America sent 2 representatives to a segregation rally in Hoxie. At that rally, a petition with more than 1,000 signatures was presented, requesting the resignation of all 5 members of the school board. The board members did not resign and voted to stand by their original decision. Arkansas Governor Orville Forbes informed the Hoxie School Board that the state government would not intervene there or in any school district. Okay, so we see a completely opposite situation to what was happening at Central High in the beginning, where Hoxie made the decision to desegregate themselves, and this magazine was highlighting how amazing this was. And that article, unintentionally got segregationists to start boycotting. So, explain what is implied by the statement, oopsies, this is still, it was like going to war every day, okay? Oh, sorry, this is still from 1B. I apologize. Oh, I apologize. I've got the old paper and not the revision. Let me just pull that up quickly. Okay, so my apologies for that. I'll just let's take that over. There we go. Now we just go down. Here we go. Hundreds of apologies for that. Let's just try to 5. That's fine. Okay, so identify the 3 reasons by Vance for the integration of schools in Hoxie, Arkansas. So directly from the source we are pulling this. This is a level 1 question. It was right inside, thank you God. It complied with the Supreme Court ruling and it saved money. Okay. Explain how the actions of the Hoxie School Board complied with the ruling of the Supreme Court on the 17th of May 1954. So the Supreme Court ruled that segregation of schools was unconstitutional and unequal. Okay. And the school board admitted children of color to the all-white school in an effort to comply with the ruling of the Supreme Court. Okay. Now, in order to get 4 marks, you must have stated that the Supreme Court ruled that the segregation of schools was unconstitutional. How did the efforts of Life magazine to acknowledge and celebrate the actions of Hoxie School Board backfire? Remember, I said that their intent was to recognize the school's effort in complying with the law, but the result was that segregationists reacted angrily to the decision. Okay. Level 3 question, explain 2 ways in which these 2 sources agree that integration was a challenging process. So we're looking at 1B, which was the Central High School, versus 1C, which was the Hoxie schools. So again, here for comparison questions, you are looking at a set of comparisons for 2 marks and another set of comparisons for an additional 2 marks. So 1B explains the segregationists reacted negatively towards them, and 1C also describes the negative reactions of segregationists. So both of them agree that segregationists reacted negatively, and it was therefore a challenge. Source 1B describes the physical and emotional abuse endured by African American students, and 1C describes the petitions and rallies to overturn the decision of the Hoxie School Board. Again, both showing the challenge. How does 1A show that Governor Forbes contradicted his decision stated in 1C? So in 1A, Forbes is being addressed by Eisenhower because he intervened at Central High School and sent the National Guard to prevent the 9 African American students from attending. But in 1C, he contradicts it because he says, I'm not going to interfere. I'm not going to intervene there or any school district. So now we look at source 1D. Okay, 1D is a visual source. Okay. So again, first the information. So this photograph taken in 1957 shows black and white students in a classroom together after the desegregation of Hoxie schools. So as you can see there, you see the white teacher and you see white students and black students sitting next to white students. So they were not shoved to one side, they were integrated in the classroom. You do, however, notice that there are less black students than white students. So, identify a visual clue in the source that indicates that integration took place at Hoxie School. Level 1 question. Okay, there are both black and white students in the picture. How does 1D show that integration was a slow process? Okay, it shows it was a slow process because the picture was taken 2 years after desegregation. Now, this is why I have told you that this information is important. I'm able to answer that question based on the date, 57. Okay? Because of the date. Alright, so it shows it was slow because the picture was taken 2 years after desegregation had started, which is 1955. And there are very few black students compared to white students. Thus, it then shows that not all black students were choosing to attend former whites-only schools. And now we get to our paragraph question, okay? Please take note of the sources that this question asks you to refer to. Sometimes it may only ask you to refer to 2 or 3 sources. Sometimes it may tell you refer to all the relevant sources. So you then have to decide for yourself which sources of these are relevant to the question, which sources are not. So this one tells you to use all the sources. So using all the sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines in which you explain what challenges schools in Arkansas faced in the attempts to desegregate. Okay. So, remember to use the Peel method when answering this question. You must have a relevant topic sentence which acknowledges that the schools in Arkansas face challenges in the attempt to desegregate. And then there's a range of things that you must that you can bring in from the sources. So for this one, it is important to contextualize your own knowledge as background, okay? That Forbes then sent the National Guard to prevent African American students from attending Central High School due to the outcry from the community and the actions of violence against the 9 when they attended, okay? And then I'm drawing a range of information from the sources. So in 1A, there were challenges from the state government, resistance to segregation, and Forbes sending the National Guard in, and Eisenhower then having to step in to intervene. From source 1B, challenges from white teachers and students. At Central High, the community of Little Rock and segregationists, okay? The attendance of African American students results in physical and emotional abuse of them, felt that they were going to war, faced rejection, suffered intolerable pain, elbowed, kicked, poked, punched, the violence against the community, etc. Okay? Challenges from the community, source 1C highlights that, and from segregationists, they reacted in ire, in anger to the decision. They gathered at City Hall to protest, they drew up a petition, and they started boycotting the school. And then source 1D shows challenges by the African American community. So we see desegregation taking place, but 2 years later, so few children in an integrated school. Okay. And there we can bring in that parents felt safer, or they felt it was better if their children attended a school in their community with people who looked like them. Okay. Remember that you must have a concluding sentence which links back to the topic sentence. Okay? Remember, you've got to use your peel method, so you've got to have that link at the end that links back to your topic sentence. And what is important is that you don't have to mention all of the information to achieve level 3 on that little rubric, but you must use all the sources in your explanation. So that is the rubric which is used to mark this particular question. Okay? And to achieve that top mark, we look there, is that you use relevant evidence from each source to explain how successful desegregation in schools in Little Rock, Arkansas was during the 1950s. Okay. Now, we are going to move on to looking at, so I should close that and that. Okay. So we are going to move on to looking at, just very briefly, very quickly, the Black Power movement essay, and I'm just very briefly going to go over the content that will be covered in your essay. Okay. So the reasons for the Black Power movement in the USA. So the Black Power movement in the USA was established in the civil rights era in the 1960s, and we are going to establish why it was necessary. So younger members of the SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, became more militant and outspoken and thought that King's nonviolent approach was not achieving social change fast enough. The Black Power movement emphasized black pride and called for the founding of black political and cultural institutions. And the violence as a legitimate means of achieving civil rights was in conflict with the mainstream civil rights movement, and the two were regarded as antagonistic towards each other. But there were groups and individuals who participated in both, because the political goals expressed by the Black Power movement were the same as the non-violent civil rights movement. So the Black Panther Party was formed in 1966 and played a short but important part in the civil rights movement. It was formed to protect local communities from police brutality. They wanted equality in education, housing, employment, and civil rights, and stated how they would achieve this in their 10-point plan. They called for freedom, full employment, decent housing, teaching the true history of African American people, an end to police brutality, an end to the murder of African Americans, free health care. They also called for a revolutionary war to achieve these goals and were willing to use violence to get what they wanted. And that was unlike the civil rights movement, which called for passive, peaceful resistance. Okay, so just have a look there for a moment at the 10-point program of the Black Panthers. So the Black Panthers started community programs. So the socialist community programs played an important part in the Panthers' strategy. They showed how politics was relevant to the people and how they cared about the needs of their communities. The first program was the Free Breakfast for Children program. They approached businessmen for donations and boycotted stores that refused to contribute. They served food to the children in church halls, and they also ran medical clinics. And the program achieved a lot with very few resources. This is an image of the Free Breakfast for Children program, which was run. They believed in militancy. The other side of the Panther program was militancy. They chose to take up their constitutional right and carry arms. If they saw an officer stop an African American, they would go over and watch with their guns on full display. And as long as they stayed a reasonable distance away, the police couldn't do anything to them. So they were not looking for shootouts and would only use their guns in self-defense. They believed in being able to use self-defense to protect themselves. The guns had a big psychological effect as African Americans felt empowered and the police felt fear. Right, the government also responded to that militancy, so the activities of the Black Panther Party came to the attention of the racist and white supremacist head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. And in 1967, the FBI set up a counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO, and its aim was to disrupt and neutralize organizations the FBI regarded as black nationalist hate groups. So COINTELPRO targeted the Black Panthers. It involved assassinations, psychological attacks, instigating and fostering mistrust, which resulted in setting African American groups against each other. The campaign destroyed the Black Panthers, and Stokely Carmichael went into exile from 1971. The Black Panthers focused on socialist community programs and free medical clinics, and COINTELPRO was then disbanded in 1971. And they had achieved their aim. So quickly, the role of Black Power leaders. Okay, so Stokely Carmichael is one of the first that we look at. So Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks were organizers within the SNCC and the first to use the term Black Power. Carmichael had taken part in the non-violent campaign and spent 49 days in prison for being a freedom rider. He became chairman of the SNCC in 1966. In 1966, James Meredith started to march from Memphis to Jackson in a march against fear, and soon after he set out, a white sniper shot him in the back. King and Carmichael decided to continue the march in his honor, but Carmichael was arrested in Greenwood, which was his 27th time being arrested. On his release, he then made a Black Power speech calling all African Americans to unite and build a sense of community. He called on African Americans to form their own organizations and adopted the slogan, "Black is Beautiful," and promoted the idea of Black pride. And it was from this point that Carmichael began to criticize King and his non-violent ideology and joined the Black Panther Party. He was elected honorary Prime Minister of the party. Malcolm X is the other individual that we look at. So he was a militant revolutionary while also being an outstanding role model and sought to bring about positive social services. The Black Panther Party aimed to follow both of these paths, and Malcolm X firmly believed in self-defense whenever African Americans were unjustly or unlawfully attacked. And it was the Black Panthers' emphasis on self-defense that inspired a generation of militants. And after leaving prison, Malcolm X became the Nation of Islam's #1 spokesperson, an organization he had joined while in prison. And while he rejected King's non-violent approach, he respected him as a leader. And in 1964, he made a pilgrimage to Mecca and returned to follow a course similar to King's, combining religious leadership and political action. Malcolm X was a socialist, and the Panthers followed his belief of working-class unity across race and gender. And the Panthers therefore argued that international working-class unity and supported joint action with white revolutionary groups, and they eventually developed into a Marxist revolutionary groups. So, that's just brief. There's also, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, the founders of the Black Panther Party, and I've got them on another PowerPoint presentation where we look at the establishment of the Black Panther Party. But just for the sake of time, I just added a few important things to this one, just so that we can get into looking at the essay. Remember, though, that your textbooks are quite comprehensive in looking at these significant individuals, and we encourage you also to read very widely, okay? So the short and long-term gains of Black Power. The Black Power declined very quickly in the late 1960s as it had little money to support itself and because the government preferred King's peaceful methods. Therefore, it seemed as if Black Power had achieved very little for black people and was a factor in the ending of the civil rights movement as a whole. They did, however, achieve something for black people, people as a whole. They tried to help people in the inner city ghettos, and they increased pride in the sense of black nationalism. And Malcolm X was important in raising the morale of many African American people and became a hero to many young African Americans in the USA and in the world. Okay, so we're going to move in now. I just want to check something really, really quickly. Okay, so this is just quickly, it's only 12 slides, and I'm going to go through it just very quickly on the Black Power movement. Okay, so black nationalists believed that the use of force was justified in order to gain social, political, and economic power for African Americans, growing out of the civil rights movement, but not a formal movement as it had no central leadership, and the Black Power movement aimed to accelerate the process of change so that African Americans had the same opportunities as whites. Why were King's ideas of non-violent protest abandoned in the 1960s? So the civil rights movement had focused on cooperation and reconciliation between black and white Americans, but inequalities remained, and African Americans still faced poverty and racial discrimination, as most African Americans in the cities lived in slum housing, the ghettos, and attended under-resourced schools. There was inadequate public transport, which made it difficult for people to take jobs far from their homes. And in 1967, 1/3 of all black families lived below the government's poverty level, compared to less than 10% of white families. And there was inadequate health care, which resulted in a mortality rate for black babies being twice as high as that for white babies. Right, some African Americans were disillusioned with the civil rights movement and believed that Martin Luther King Jr. was too moderate. They rejected the idea of nonviolent protest as they wanted to accelerate the pace of change in the USA, and the struggle for equal rights in the USA took a new direction in the 1960s with the growing popularity of the Black Power movement. African Americans who supported the Black Power movement believed that using violence was justified if it meant gaining equality for all Americans, and Black Power instilled a feeling of racial pride and self-worth in African Americans. For the first time, they were encouraged to acknowledge their African heritage and take pride in their culture. Malcolm X, the leader of the Nation of Islam, was an eloquent advocate for black power, and he maintained that African Americans must fight for equal rights, even if this meant using violence. And young urban African Americans were drawn to his ideas. Okay. So the Black Panther Party believed in all power to the people. So, who were they? Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party for self-defense in 1966. They began as a group whose goal was to protect African American neighborhoods from police brutality and racism. The Black Panthers said that African Americans should carry guns to defend themselves. They were involved in police shootouts in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles in the late 1960s and early 1970s. When the state of California attempted to outlaw the carrying of loaded weapons in public, fully armed members of the Black Panther Party then staged a protest. The idea of black power frightened many whites. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, called the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. And the Black Panther Party was subjected to a great deal of police harassment, and in 1967 Huey Newton was arrested for the murder of a policeman in Oakland, California, and he claimed that he had been falsely accused, though he later admitted that he was responsible, and the Black Panther Party launched a Free Huey campaign. So here, the Black Panther Party instituted programs to help alleviate poverty in black communities, such as the Free Breakfast for Children program, which fed thousands of poor and hungry black children every day. As we mentioned, the clinics where children and adults could get free medical care, and a tutoring scheme to help black learners succeed at school. We looked at this in the last presentation, the 10-point program, and what they wanted: freedom, full employment, housing, etc. At the 1968 Olympics, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, two American medalists, gave the Black Power salute during the playing of the American national anthem. and they were demonstrating against continuing racial discrimination in the USA. As a result, they were stripped of their medals and banned from future Olympics. At a press conference after the event, Tommy Smith made the following statement: "If I win, I am an American, not a black American. But if I did something bad, then they would say a Negro. We are black, and we are proud of being black." Okay? So as you can see, the Black Panthers were very popular in the 1960s. They were involved in defending the rights of both workers and ethnic minorities like the African American communities in the ghettos. And what they wanted was equal rights and equal representation. Right. Malcolm X, the leading figure in the Black Power movement and as a powerful speaker and dedicated human rights activist. In 1952, he became the leading member of the Nation of Islam, which was a black Muslim group which taught that white society was holding African Americans back from empowering themselves, and separating black and white Americans was necessary so that people did not depend on whites. His passion attracted many new members to the organization, and the membership grew from 500 in 1952 to 30,000 in 1963, and he voiced the feelings of frustration and anger that were common to the northern ghettos and openly criticized whites for being murderers and hypocrites. He promoted the use of violence to achieve the aims of Black Power, which challenged the peaceful protests of Martin Luther King Jr. And like Marcus Garvey, he urged blacks to separate themselves from white society, rejected integration and non-violence, and he called on blacks to defend themselves with violence whenever necessary to overthrow white domination. He urged African Americans to take pride in being black. He was in favor of after pilgrimage to Mecca in 1963 to 1964. He changed his ideas about integration as he had seen how Muslims of all nationalities could live together peacefully, and he began working for integration rather than against it. He founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity in 1964 and became less militant, but these new views were not popular with black nationalists as they included that not all whites were evil and that blacks could bring about change by working through established channels. And he was then assassinated on the 21st February 1965 by black nationalists who did not like his change of heart. But his message lived on for some years. Urban riots took place in the USA from 64 to 68, made it clear that many blacks had given up on the idea that non-violent protests could change the conditions in the North, and he is still remembered for raising the self-esteem of black Americans and fighting for their rights. Okay, Stokely Carmichael, and we also looked at him in the last one. Okay, so he joined the civil rights movement during the sit-in, and then he was a member of the SNCC and a freedom rider. And he later on, when he was arrested during the march and released from jail, he made the speech in which he used the term Black Power. Okay, he also believed in black nationalism. Okay. And he then convinced SNCC organized to expel white members from the organization in 1966. And in 1967, he and many others broke away from the SNCC and co-wrote the book Black Power to promote Malcolm X's message. And the term Black Power came to be linked with militancy, self-reliance, independence, and nationalism within the ranks of the civil rights movement. And he urged African Americans to take pride in being black. He was in favor of African American dress, Afro hairstyles. He wanted African Americans to recognize their heritage and build a sense of community, and adopted the slogan, "Black is beautiful." Right. He also started to criticize passive resistance leaders like King, and who wanted to work with whites, and he later joined the Black Panther Party, where he promoted the Black Power movement as a leader, speaker, and writer. Okay, so the militant philosophies of Malcolm X also prompted frustrated activists Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California, to form the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in 1966. So unlike the SCLC, NAACP, SNCC, or CORE, the Black Panthers demanded equal rights and access to equal facilities according to their 10-point plan. So they promoted, they dressed entirely in black, they armed themselves with guns. They called for people to carry arms to protect themselves. They aimed to protect African American neighborhoods from police brutality and racism. And they did so through patrols and to keep an eye out for violence. To help ease poverty in black communities, they started programs such as the Free Breakfast for Children program, the free clinics, the free education centers, and also provided groceries to people in need. They were very popular in the 60s as they were involved in defending the rights of both workers and ethnic minorities. But the extremism and willing to use violence alienated and threatened moderate whites in the north, and the federal government also viewed the Panthers as a threat and cracked down on the group between 1968 and 1969, resulting in the end of the organization. So just briefly looking at the essay topics that you're going to be looking at in this section. Okay, so looking at some of the essay topics critically discussed, the role played by the Black Power movement, the various Black Power organizations in bringing about major changes to the African American people. Why did they emerge is another possible topic, okay? Although they did not achieve major political change, they played an important role, such as raising black morale, raising awareness of the problems, and encouraging black social and economic self-empowerment. A statement that it drew out of the disillusionment, unhappiness of people with the civil rights movement, and then commenting on that. And the last one looking at that it emerged for reasons that were both relevant and justifiable. So asking you to analyze different aspects of either why they emerged or what they did. So how do we respond to a question like this? Okay, it's important for us to look at the causes, events, and results. Okay, and we will analyze these within any question that is asked about the Black Power movement. Okay, so the cause, the slow pace of change with the civil rights movement, police brutality, the persistent inequality which resulted in poverty, poor education, crime, and the police brutality that was happening, as well as violence from white supremacists. This then leads to the event which is that migration, with millions of people moving to the northern states to escape racial oppression and segregation in the southern states. And it results in black people not being welcomed in the northern states. Racism and inequality, not officially condoned, but it's still very widespread, and that causes a wave of violent protests that occurred in the northern US states during the 1960s. Okay? We then look at the cause. There was a desire to create a positive black identity, and the civil rights movement had a desire for integration. Okay? What events are we looking at over here? Rejecting the term Negro, embracing the term black, celebrating black culture and history, forming solidarity with Pan-Africanism, and viewing African Americans as colonized people. Alright? The result? Rejecting integration into mainstream American society, promoting radical revolutionary change as a result. Okay. We then look at the prominent role in student nonviolent coordinating committees. Okay, so looking at Stokely Carmichael in this sense as being, the topic is on Stokely Carmichael himself, the paragraph topic. So what were the causes of him joining the party? He had a prominent role in the SNCC. He was involved in the sit-ins, a freedom rider, and involved in the Selma to Montgomery March. Okay. Now, he is that bridge between the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. Okay, he renounces nonviolence, steps down from the SNCC, joins the Black Panther Party. He calls for USA withdrawal from Vietnam. He's critical of the US support for undemocratic governments, and he argued that white activists should work in white communities to promote nonviolence, and he's responsible for promoting the phrase Black Power. Disagrees with the Black Panther Party decision to allow whites to participate, and he left the USA and moved to Guinea in 1968 changed his name to Kwame Ture after African President Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Toure. Malcolm X we look at in this particular paragraph. Family poverty and victims of hate crimes has been the cause. Arrested for housebreaking, served 7 years in prison. He was very politicized, converted to Islam, completed his education and left prison in 1952. Okay. So the Nation of Islam teachings that were adopted by Malcolm X, that's the event that we're discussing. Islam seen as more authentic and African religion, white society actively trying to keep African Americans down, and Malcolm X's activists for self-defense instead of non-violence, black nationalism instead of non-racialism, black separatism instead of integration, and revolution instead of reform. Okay. He changes his surname from Little to X to symbolize his lost tribal name, and also very symbolic of slaves who didn't have a name and would sign their name with an X, or African Americans who were uneducated and illiterate were signing their names with an X. Became the most prominent speaker for the Nation of Islam, and it grew from a few hundred members in 1952 to 75,000 in 1960. Okay. Another event that we discussed within this essay topic is Malcolm X's assassination. Okay. What caused the assassination and the result of that as well. Alright, so his inspiration inspires others like Muhammad Ali and Huey Newton of the Black Panthers. We then look at the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Okay. Who formulated the Black Panther Party? Why was it formed? What they stood for, what they did, like the Black Panther community programs, their 10-point program, and that idea you've got to emphasize there. They wanted self-reliance, they wanted safe neighborhoods, they wanted separation from white USA, and they pushed a socialist agenda. Okay. Which obviously got them, is what got them highlighted by the FBI and Hoover. What was the result of the Black Panther Party? We look at the California banning open carry laws in 1968. The majority of the members in the Black Panther Party were women. Look at the role of Angela Davis, for example, who was a very prominent member. We look at the numerous shootouts they had with police. That raised media awareness of racism, and they contributed to community upliftment. So at the end of an essay topic like this, we're looking at the short-term gains, highlighting the discrimination in the northern states, the 1968 Commission, which found poor housing, poverty, police brutality, and schooling contributed to a sense of hopelessness. It results then in the Economic Opportunity Act, which in turn reduces poverty in African American, or aims to reduce poverty in African American communities. It's important here to remember that whatever topic you are going to get, and we just look again at some of the topics, and I'm just going to reduce this, I can put just a few more on the screen, that it is important over there to remember using our Peel method, and I went through this, you can go through the previous videos to have a look at how I've done it. Okay, using the Peel method to construct our argument, okay, having your point, your evidence explanation, and then always linking the information that you've spoken about in that paragraph back to the thesis statement that you made in your introduction. Okay, so we come now to the end of this series of lessons. There are 4 in the series, and then you have the winter school, the longer winter school lesson that happened as well, which covered paper 1 and paper 2 in its entirety, and then this series of lessons which looked at paper 1, one question, one topic per session. So there are 4 lessons in the series. Please go back and have a look. There were, important aspects of how to answer the questions that I dealt with in some of the previous recordings. And I really hope that helps you to not only consolidate the knowledge that you have been taught by your teachers, but also helps you to do some revision and makes you feel a bit more confident for approaching your examinations. Remember that we will be running also a spring school program in the coming weeks, so be on the lookout for those. And And remember to share that information with friends of yours at other schools who maybe don't know about the REACT program or haven't been involved with it at all. Okay, but thank you for watching this video, and I really do wish you all the best with both your prelim examinations as well as your final examinations.